They've supported the Ukrainian opposition since the very beginning of the protests, and now the US and the EU are even threatening Kiev with sanctions. Well, more on this. Let's talk to RT's Polly Boyko, who's in Berlin. Polly, any sign of these sanctions then on the horizon?
Well, since this most recent escalation of violence in Kiev, there's been a considerable amount of pressure on Ukraine already from outside the country. We've already had the US Embassy in Kiev said that it's going to revoke the visas of certain Ukrainian officials that are linked to the violence that's been taking place. And the US Embassy there has said that it's considering further action. And the European Union could be following suit because they've placed the blame for what's taking place in Kiev solely on the Ukrainian leadership. The president of the European Commission, Jose Manuel Barroso, has said that the EU may have to rethink its entire relationship with Ukraine, and they are warning of further consequences. He hasn't specified what those consequences might be, but one MEP today spoke about the pre-sanctions step of potentially checking the EU bank accounts of certain Ukrainian oligarchs that are linked to the Ukrainian leadership. Now, the implication there is that perhaps further down the line they could be freezing those bank accounts. But we are getting quite mixed messages from the European Union. On the one hand, there are these potential consequences, these threats, but one MEP today also speaking about the association agreement still being very much on the table for Ukraine. Proof of that is in the fact that the EU official who's responsible for widening the EU net, so to say, the European Commissioner for Enlargement and Neighbourhood Policy, well, he's visiting Ukraine on Friday. So on the one hand, we've got condemnation of what's taking place, very tough talk and threats. And on the other hand, we've got talk of Ukraine eventually still signing on that dotted line.
Polly, thanks very much indeed for that. RT's Polly Boyko live there in Berlin. Well, the US and the EU are justifying the unrest by saying it was provoked by the Ukrainian authorities, as we just heard there from Polly. And Mark Sloboda, who's a senior international relations lecturer and researcher from Moscow State University, explains why he believes the decision is hypocritical.
What we're hearing from the United States and from the European Union is, of course, the most cynical hypocrisy. After the last few years of the brutal police repressions of the Occupy Wall Street movement in the United States and the anti-neoliberal austerity diktats that have been instituted around the European Union, which brought literally tens of millions of protesters out onto the street, them calling against violence in the Ukraine, where the majority of the injuries for the past few days have been from the police that have suffered injuries from Molotov cocktails, fire bombs, knife stabbings, clubbings with morning stars, withered shots from trebuchets constructed in the Maidan, and bows and arrows. I mean, we're frequently seeing a level of medieval violence from the protesters. That is where the real violence in these protests is coming from.
Leaders of the Ukrainian opposition say the president refused to answer their questions during negotiations today, but they could continue tomorrow with talks. However, he did admit the cabinet's resignation is not impossible. And one opposition leader, Vladimir Klitschko, urged protesters to remain on Maidan Square and go on the offensive. Well, I was earlier joined in the studio by RT News editor Iva Crotty and Irina Galushko, who has witnessed some of the rioting over recent weeks in Kiev. The grassroots elements of this protest, is it justified? The government's been accused of authoritarian and also corrupt. Do you think the protesters do have a right and a justification for what's happening?
Do they have a right to go out and protest? Of course, yes, they do. Do they have a right to set policemen on fire, calling themselves the nation who are ready to be part of Europe and saying they are Europe and they have to follow the European model of behavior? I'm sorry, but I would have to say no.
All right, talking about the way the authorities handle it then, the EU have been very critical. You were there. How did you see the way the police were dealing with the riots before, or the demonstrations, I should say, before they kicked off?
The police were told to not use any force whatsoever. They had rocks thrown at them. They had Molotov cocktails thrown at them. Until today, there was no retaliation from police, essentially, or until last night, you can say. They were they had strict instructions not to follow the provocations.
But it's worth mentioning, though, right now, I think what we're seeing a change in tactics on the side of the police. We saw an armoured personnel carrier on Grushevskova this afternoon, and that may be a signal of a new steel to police
Would that
tactics.
be the sort of thing you'd see in Madrid or London, indeed Brussels or New York? Because obviously the authorities have been criticised.
Of course it would. Of course it would. Can you imagine something like this taking place in Washington, New York, or for goodness sake? Of course it would. It would never have been allowed to go this far. And that's, again, why Yanukovych perhaps has played himself into a corner.
OK, what happens to him next, then? Should he call for early elections?
He's going to be criticised by the Liberals, and he's going to be damned if he doesn't, damned if he doesn't.
But is he in trouble? I mean, they're talking of a revolution here. Is he in serious trouble?
Everybody recognises that. I mean, anybody who realistically assesses the situation, I think, recognises talk of a revolution is overblown, and patently unrealistic. The guy's got an electoral mandate, and for a regime change to take place in the European space would create a huge ripple right across the European Union as well. Right, I just don't think it's on.
So, what do you make of this opposition then? Is it credible? Is it mature? Is it united?
Absolutely not. But just a couple of days ago, before the riots actually broke out, people on the Independence Square, on the Maidan, were yelling "Leader, leader," because they were not seeing that leader. They were already dissatisfied with all three of the top opposition leaders. So at this point, even if they did reach an agreement with Yanukovych, they could come out there on Maidan and say something, but people will not hear them.
But Ivor, much talk of a divided country. Why aren't we seeing the supporters of Yanukovych? Because people blatantly say it's East and West, a division there, and there's a lot of support for Yanukovych from the East, but we're not seeing any support.
There have been rallies in Ukraine, or I beg your pardon, in Kiev recently. This week, in fact, I've seen pictures of rallies and seen reports of rallies, pro-Yanukovych rallies. But frankly, I don't think anybody's particularly encouraged by the idea of walking into Kiev and protesting amid what looks like a battlefield right now.